All right, that is probably the toughest act I'll ever have to follow. I don't even know if I can do that justice. Thank you, Simone, for doing such a great presentation. And also, thank you to JS Channel for making such a wonderful conference. This has been really, really awesome, and all of the speakers have been great so far. Thank you. If you can give them a round of applause for organizing. All right, without further ado, let's learn how to animate in Vue and to animate in general. My name is Sarah Drasner. I go by Sarah Edo on Twitter. This is me as a child and also my relationship with authority. Yeah, as I said, I'm Sarah Edo on Twitter. I'm a consultant, which does not mean that I'm unemployed. I actually am really lucky to work with all of these people here. But I just recently decided to take a job with Microsoft as a senior cloud developer advocate. So I'm really excited about that project. I haven't started yet. Right now, I'm still a consultant, but I'm going to be making a lot of weird, crazy things with machine learning and SVG and with Azure. So if you want to check that out, I'll be doing that in the future. OK. So before we dig into all the ways that you can animate on the web, it's important to go over why you'd even want to animate in the first place. Strangely enough, our story starts with performance. In building websites, we have something called a so what factor. People start off intrigued, but that curiosity is finite. We know that user attention span is short, and we have around 2 seconds before it totally drops off. Amazon's discovered that for every 1 second delay, conversions drop by 7%. Walmart's found that it gains 1% revenue increase for every 100 milliseconds of improvement. So we also know from MRI scans that if people have to wait for a site to load for more than 4 seconds, they have the same kind of visceral reaction that they do when they watch a horror film. No joke. So I guess this would be like if you were waiting for Burger King's site to load or something. We also know that there's an impact to the way that your site feels in terms of a thing called perceived performance. Humans actually overestimate passive wait times by 36%. So that means that your site could take about 3 seconds to load or something, but it would feel way longer. Eli Fitch talked about this in a talk last year called Perceived Performance, the Only Kind That Matters. I think that's a great name for a talk. This also means that by measuring things with your timeline and benchmarks in your console, it's not really telling you the full story. Vuex did an experiment and found that people were willing to wait twice as long for a custom loader than a standard one. And take a look at this loader. It's not really that amazing or intense or anything. It's just a few dots going across. But just by doing like a bit of a custom experience, people were willing to wait twice as long. It doesn't take much to let your users know that you care about them. So what's happening here? Well, in order to use a website, your eyes scan around in an event called saccade. These are heat maps of an eye moving across the site to try to make a mental map of where everything is located. So evolutionarily speaking, this is really important. This is how we as humans have evolved to learn how to eat something if it's moving around, or learn how to run away from something if it's a predator. So we're always creating these spatial maps of our environment. So anything that moves draws us our attention more than anything else. So in regular life, we've evolved to perform acts that flow more or less seamlessly. We're not really wired to deal with fits and starts of human-computer interaction. A computer might quickly understand a Boolean state, but humans have never evolved to have something just appear before us. We're accustomed to transitions. Someone doesn't just appear in the room. They walk in. They're transitioning in. Your occipital lobe works in, your memory store works in these 100 millisecond bursts. So it's really important to draw connections between states. And we haven't really evolved to see something just appear before us, right? Like, if anything appears before us, it's usually a really bad sign. So that's why when you're like scanning something on mobile, or you're trying to use a website on mobile, and all of a sudden a modal pops up, your first instinctual reaction is like, get it away from me. So that's not really the kind of UX or application state that we want for our users. So here's an example of how we can gain spatial understanding on the web. This is an example from Code Drops, where you're just choosing your seat at a movie theater, and you get a real understanding of the experience ahead of you. You're also seamlessly transitioning from one state to another. Without transitions, we lose an opportunity. The user has to remap every interactive space, and it doesn't feel as fluid. It feels more clunky. So in Paul Bacchus's Illusion of Speed, it's a great article that he wrote. Paul Bacchus works for Google. He addresses some studies that show that small movements in short activities are perceived as really long because of the cognitive load that it imposes, whereas those same moments captured as a long composition are remembered as short. So I made this pen to show you what that might look like. In this instance, we have a map marker that becomes a contact form. Labels move out of the way to gather input, and they become the loaders that in turn become the success. So now if I asked you, where's the contact form? You would say, it's in there. But there's no in there. It's all just absolutely positioned elements fitting inside of a container unit. And even though you're taken through a bunch of different views, you're taken through like 4 different pieces of that application state, it all felt really like one fluid movement. So some of you might be familiar with this idea of a flow state. It's our job to ensure that our users get as close to living in that flow state as possible and not interrupted like this little pug here. How many of you have lost time on Twitter or Facebook? That's what we want. We want the user to feel so empowered in our app that it feels like an extension of ourselves. So one way of doing this is to figure out what the final state is. If you spend a moment aligning yourself with the end goal, it all of a sudden offers clarity for what should happen in between. This also helps track what validation looks like, what a successful project looks like, and whether or not your A/B tests are in support of that or hindering it. So people often ask me how to animate in Vue, but the amazing thing is that there isn't just one way. We'll go over a whole slew of them today in this keynote and have all of your bases covered. So first, since Vue is relatively a young framework and people might not have worked with it, I'm going to go through some of the functionality of it and quickly run through some Vue basics so that you have the fundamental knowledge to understand the rest of the talk. Vue was built by some core members that have a really strong understanding of developer needs, especially animation. So they've created a transition component that covers almost all of developers' needs. So we'll start there. Then we'll talk about watchers and the reactivity system. So Vue is a reactive framework, and I'm going to explain what that means in specific and how we can plug in to some of the things that are going on under the hood with animation. We're also going to talk about SVG because SVG is built with math, and there's tons of cool stuff that we can do with it when we pair with Vue and animation. We're going to do some event-driven animation with user input. We're going to coordinate state with Vuex, which is similar to Redux, and dig into some lifecycle methods. We're also going to talk about animations via custom directives. Don't worry, I'll explain what all these things are. And we're also going to talk about Nuxt for server-side rendering and page transitions. Okay, so let's start with some Vue basics. So this is, in order to kind of give you an idea of what Vue is, it's a framework, and I'm going to give you just a small comparison. So it has a virtual DOM, so if you're used to something like React, that concept will be familiar to you. It has reactive components that offer the Vue layer only. So it's not an MVC, it's a Vue layer just like React is. It has props and a Redux-like store similar to React, so Vuex is kind of similar to Redux. It has conditional rendering and services, similarly built to Angular. And it's inspired by Polymer for simplicity and performance. It offers a similar development style with single-page templates with HTML styles and JavaScript, all composed in tandem and kind of scoped to that one component. That's as far as I'm going to go into a comparison. If you'd like to see a bigger or like more in-depth comparison, the Vue guides has a really, really great comprehensive comparison of all these different frameworks, so you can check that out. Okay, so in order to understand Vue's capabilities as a framework, we'll do the wonderfully obligatory Hello World example. We'll create the relationship with a div ID app here, and then we can begin by holding the data for the app, which in this case is text, and we can output it in these mustache templates here. So that's pretty simple. You can see the data, and there's text, and then we're outputting text right there in the div ID app. You can also see that the element inside the Vue instance is creating a relationship with the div ID app. I could have called that anything. So let's do a really light comparison of just vanilla JavaScript and then implementing some conditional rendering versus Vue. So let's say we're getting some information from a server or an API, and we have to output it onto our web page. Here's a simple array that has some dummy info that we're working with. Then we'll create a function, we'll make an empty string, loop through the number of items, and every time we'll add the index wrapped in an li to the string. Then we'll dive into the DOM, go get a container of some sort, and update the inner HTML to our list, and we'll wrap it in a UL as we do so. And then we'll call that function, then we'll add a container ID to the DOM so that we can access it. It's pretty imperative. It's kind of like steps to a recipe, and from here, if we wanted to manipulate something or see what happened to these items, we'd have to dive back into the DOM and kind of check what happened. So that eventually gets a little bit convoluted and a little bit spaghetti. But so here's the output. We just have like this list of items here, not amazing. In a Vue instance, we're storing the data and we're holding the data. So if you're used to any of these other frameworks, you're kind of used to that idea as well. So we can output it in a manner by using something called a directive, in this case v4, and it's a really legible way of writing this. The other thing you can see is that we're storing the data in control of it. So we're looping through these items, item and item, and then we're outputting whatever index of that item is. So this is super legible, and we're in control, and the DOM is not. And it's functionally equivalent. It outputs the same markup for less trouble. I love this approach because it's clean, it's easy to maintain. I'm a consultant, so I dive into code bases that I'm not familiar with, and when I work with a Vue code base, I immediately know where everything is. It's really easy to read. I don't have to understand a ton of context in order to get working almost right away, and I can be super productive. It's also reactive, which I won't dive into yet, but I'll cover a little bit further in this talk. So it's semantic. You can write really semantic markup with this and make things good for screen readers. That's always good. It's very declarative, as you just saw. It's super legible. It's easy to maintain. And yeah, we'll go into reactive in a minute. You may be wondering why I'm showing you a picture of an iPhone. I'm not going to talk about mobile dev. I'm showing an iPhone because I remember when I first got an iPhone. It was this sophisticated piece of equipment that I knew that some of the most educated and smartest engineers in the world were working with, and it had limitless capabilities. It was really, really powerful. Yet, when I used it, I never felt pandered to. I never felt like its complexities or its capabilities were getting in my way. I always felt like I was in charge. Everything was right at my fingertips, and I could leverage its sophistication. That's how I feel when I use Vue. So in order to help keep you productive, Vue offers a lot of ways to work with deeper functionality, such as directives stolen from Angular. So these directives keep us from yak shaving and re-implementing the same thing over and over again, and kind of offer things that we're really used to working with as developers. I'm only going to go through one of them. There's tons of directives, but just to show you how something like this might work. So one of the more interesting directives is vModel. It creates a relationship between the data in the instance or component and something like a form input so you can dynamically update values. Here we're going to create a Vue instance, store a basic string in our data so that we can allow the user to modify it and still be the owner of the state of it. So if you've worked with React before, this way of thinking about initial state will be kind of familiar. This text area here is just a normal semantic text area, except that it has this vModel that connects it to that message. So that establishes a relationship with the data in our Vue instance. And then when a user types things, we're automatically both allowing it to update, but they can write whatever that they want to. And this is pretty rad because when we build out a large-scale application, a lot of what we do is managing things in response to user input. And in terms of animation, because this relationship was established with such ease, it's also incredibly simple to create advanced effects based on information that's given. You already know how half of this demo works. And by the end of the talk, you'll know how the other half of the demo works. Ta-da! Okay, so let's dig into the transition component for a moment. So if we have a really simple component here, we just have a div, and we have an h2, and we have this thing called slot, which allows us to replace the some of the content of our component without passing any kind of prop. We can use props as well, but this allows us to change what's inside of that component with ease. So then we can have something like this div ID app. We can say something like, let's trigger this modal, and we can have this click event that's going to toggle something based on a condition, in this case, whether or not it's showing. And then we're going to show this component, this thing called appchild, based on whether or not the showing is true or not. So as you might assume, we have something like this child component with a template, and then we have this is showing false, which is not showing at first, and then we're just toggling it back and forth. And then we have something like this modal. So that's not that impressive. That's just like, kind of basic JavaScript and stuff. So let's maybe spice it up with a little bit of animation. We had just talked about how popping things into people's view is not actually the best way of working with stuff. So if you haven't worked with it before, here's what the transition component looks like. It's very simple and easy to read and maintain. It's just wrapping that component. And Vue's done a really great job of understanding these kind of transitions of state in a responsible, maintainable, and declarative manner. Here you see we have two ways of describing what's changing that we can hook into, enter and leave. We have vEnter or vLeave for what the transition right before the hook is occurring, or the hook but right before the transition's occurring. Then we have that vEnter active when it's actually happening, and vEnter 2, which is when it's completed. So all pieces of this are optional. And our transition will plug into the enter active class. So that's when the transition is occurring. It's basically what's in control of that interpolating those values. So we're using a transition here, not an animation yet. So I'm just going to say, OK, we want something like color. We want it to happen for 1 second. And we want to have it have an ease. So we're allowing the browser to interpolate those values for us. So it's also reusable for other components. If we want to give it a name, we can do so and then reuse that transition again and again. Just as an aside, when you're animating, here we're going to use ease out. But if you're ever animating and you want to do something a little bit more sophisticated, entrances use ease out kind of eases, and exits use ease in. So that's kind of not what you would think it is. I didn't name it or anything. But that's how you make a really beautiful animation. And a lot of people add these enter to and fade leave, so the beginning parts of those animations. But if it's the default, you don't have to specify it. And I would actually say that even saying this, aside from writing more code, is kind of illegible. But also, it's not very forward-thinking, because let's say you decide to change that element to opacity 0.8 or something later on, then right before the transition occurs, it's going to pop into the old view and then transition. So it's kind of better to not state that as the default. So what we end up getting is, this kind of simple transition here, which is great. But what would happen if we want to make that background content fade out of view so that the modal took center stage and the background lost focus? We could use the transition component, but we'd have to wrap the whole background, and that gets kind of messy, and that's not really what we want. All we really want to do is change a few styles based on a condition. So luckily for us, Vue's really great at letting us do such a change with ease. So this is a pretty legible way of writing those classes. We're actually allowing to change those classes based on a simple ternary. And then in our Vue instance, we're going to state what those classes will be so that we can then hook into them and create some transitions. We have the transition class, as well as some amount of blur and some amount of opacity we'll be adjusting. So then we have this modal, which is a little bit better. You can see the background fade in and out of view. Replay it here. Yeah. OK, so let's do some more sophisticated things. Aside from keeping the changes consistent and granular, there's nice pieces of sugar offered here, like transition modes. What this will let us do is say, okay, if two things are changing at once, does one transition wait for the other to enter or exit before the other one's firing? That's actually a really typical use case. So if you are usually having two things animate, one is animating in and one's animating out, they'll fire at the same time and they'll both be in the DOM at once and it'll be kind of crowded for a second and it looks really clunky. So usually the way that we handle that is one, you'll give like an imposed delay. So you'll take the duration of the first animation and then you'll give the other one a delay for that amount of time. That kind of sucks because then if you change the duration, you have to go then change the delay. Another way of writing that if you're in JavaScript is to make a callback, but you can kind of get into callback hell and that's also pretty imperative. So Vue allows us to just simply state that you want one thing to wait and then the other one to appear, and it'll happen right away. You don't have to write any extra code for that. So this looks like it's one element, but it's actually two elements. One is going like this, and the other one is going like this as it comes in. And you can see that it happens really seamlessly and really fluidly. Without transition modes, you can see that this kind of thing happens, which is not a huge deal, but what ends up happening is they're both happening at the same time, so you don't see one of the transitions occurring. So of the two modes, you have in-out, which is the current element waits for the new element transitioning into fire, or out-in, the current element transitions out, and then the new element transitions in. Usually you want out-in. That's the one I reach for 9 times out of 10. So the way that that code looks like is this. You have this transition, that one that we were using to wrap the thing, and then all I write is mode out-in, and Vue does the rest of the work. It's worth mentioning at this point that not all properties are created equally. Opacity and transforms will give you the smallest amount of repaints and the best performance. Here are also some properties that will allow you to create hardware acceleration, like backface visibility hidden and perspective. I wrote an article about this on CSS Tricks, and then there's another article there that's a resource. I'll give you the slide links later. There's links accessible in there. Okay, so we talked about a transition. How about an animation? We'll still use the transition component, but now we can assign classes to the enter and leave states. That way we can reuse animations or plug into a CSS animation library if we wish. So we can do something like this, where we say enter active class is this one, and the leave active class is this other one. So we can do something like this, bouncing a ball. One thing is clearly bouncing and the other one's clearly rolling, so I wouldn't want them to be named the same, right? I would want them to have different names. So here we have that component. We're clicking this button. It's the same kind of thing as the modal. We have this transition, and we have the enter active class is bounce in, leave active class is roll out. And bounces in CSS are a bit of a drag compared to JavaScript, but we can make our code a little bit more dry by using a mix-in and not having to repeat ourselves as much. Okay, so now we get to the really good stuff. JavaScript's really powerful for animation, so let's do some cool stuff with Vue and JavaScript hooks. Here we have some custom naming for our hooks. Each part is available to us, but each part is also optional. You don't have to use any of these if you don't want to. We also are binding the CSS and saying that it's false. That allows Vue to know that it doesn't need to go looking in your CSS for any of these classes. It's going to go right to JavaScript. And this is probably the most basic example, so I don't use all of those hooks. I use something like enter and leave and CSS false. And here's the most basic example within Vue. I have in my methods enter the element that I'm going to be targeting so that it'll automatically pass that as a param, this element, and then it'll automatically allow me to access something like done. So at the end of my animation, I'm going to state done so that I can use those transition hooks and it can really seamlessly flow. So in this demo, we can hook up vModel and animate our text onto the book in a playful manner. And here we've got a transition component with before enter, enter, and a CSS false binding. And in data, we have the default content in before enter, in before enter. So in before enter, we have all of the styles that we need to be setting on the thing before it starts animating. And in enter, we're using a loop, and then we're just saying where we want everything coming from, and we're kind of using z-index and a bunch of other things to scatter the words around and bounce them around. A lot of people ask me why I do things like setting things in the before enter in JavaScript instead of putting them in the CSS. I could have also just applied all of these things in the CSS. Part of the reason why I do this is because if someone comes along after me, all of these things like transform perspective, transform style, they don't actually change the appearance of those letters when it's still. When it's not animating, it doesn't adjust them or make them look any different. So someone could easily come along behind me and be like, what's this code doing here? Oh, I just deleted some code. This is great. And like, just take it out of there, and then the animation breaks. So I try to keep those all together, and also because I did actually adjust the perspective as I was working on this. So I can easily go back and forth without context switching. It's all right in that one area. So in some cases, putting a done at the end of the statement is fine, but in some animation libraries, they offer things like a timeline. So Mo.js or GreenSock that offer timelines will prefer if you pass done into an onComplete method. So that's just a little gotcha to pay attention to. All right. Vue is really awesome because it actually grants us deeper access into the reactivity system, which we can leverage for asynchronous updates and also animations and transitions. So the way we'll plug into the system is something called watchers. And in order for you to understand how we're working with them, let's talk about reactivity in general first. So what's reactive? People seem to be a little bit confused about what reactive is because people think that Rx.js is reactive, and they're not wrong. Rx.js is indeed reactive programming, but reactive programming is actually a larger umbrella under which a lot of other things are. So Rx.js is a piece of this wider idea of reactivity. So what is reactive? Reactive programming is programming with asynchronous data streams. What? Okay, let's break that down a little bit further. A stream is a sequence of ongoing events ordered in time that offer us some hooks with which to observe it. So basically, actually, like a good example of this would be something like a hover state. I think a lot of people use that as an example. If you're about to click on or hover a hover state, that moment where you make contact with the element before it starts transitioning, that's a hook with which you can observe something. Then it's going to interpolate a state, and that's another hook with which to observe it. And when it ends up at another state, that's another hook with which to observe it. So that's a really simplified example, but it kind of gives you the idea. So when we use reactive premises for building applications, that means it's really easy to update state in reaction to events, which is a lot of what makes programming applications kind of complicated. Andre Saltz has a great post about this. It's very long, but it's really detailed and really awesome. So what is reactive in terms of frameworks? And I just said that they're not all the same, right? Angular 1 has dirty checking. Cycle and Angular 2 use reactive streams like Xstream and Rx.js. Vuex, MobX, and Reactive all use a variation of getters and setters. So we'll talk about getters and setters today. Despite the name, React is not reactive. I thought it was actually, I was talking to Dan Aberoff, he's like, no, it's not. It uses a pull approach rather than a push approach. And if you want more resources and more materials about that, here's the React design documentation. That will actually go to an anchor tag which talks about this thing in specific. There's more docs about Vue's reactivity documentation, and Damien Dulles from Montreal wrote a really great post about all of this. So in Vue, we're taking the data object, or a function that returns the object, walking through these properties and converting them to getters and setters. Vue can't detect property or addition or deletion, so we're using this object to create dependency tracking and change notification on anything that we store. Each component has a watcher instance. The properties touched by the watcher during the render are registered as dependencies. And then when the setter's triggered, it lets the watcher know and causes the component to re-render. So if we have something like this Vue instance with a couple of different things, we've got a message here and another message, I can console log that Vue instance so that we can look at it really quickly. And then let's say I'm going to just set a new property outside of the Vue instance. I'll say vm.thing equals, I forget what I wrote here, some other thing. I am a new, God, I'm typing really slowly when I'm not, when I'm recording this. Okay, so here we have the Vue instance that's in our console log. Let's look at it. Okay, so here we see the message and the other message, and then we also see the other thing that we stored. But you see these getters and setters for message and other message. You don't see them for that thing that we set outside of the Vue instance. Also, if we go into the Vue dev tools, you can see message and other message here, but not that other thing. And one more way of checking that is that V model that we looked at earlier. The message works. I can say all sorts of things like thing, or I'm another message, or whatever. But if I actually write thing, that other thing that we wrote, that won't work, and it will break. Yay, it's broken. Okay. So watchers are really good for asynchronous updates and updates to transitions or any kind of data changes. So we're going to watch any data property declared on the Vue instance. So here you can see in the data here, oh, I need to like make this actually play, sorry. Go ahead. Okay, there we go. So here you can see there's this thing called counter, and then we're watching that property counter and console logging anytime that changes. So you can see that we're watching that property. Anytime the property changes, that console log will appear. So the Vue instance is the middleman between the DOM and the business logic. Watch updates the DOM only if it's required. Performing calculations in JavaScript is really performant, but accessing the DOM is not. So we have a virtual DOM, which is kind of like a copy, but it's parsed in JavaScript. So we're going to make all these calculations here. You can see that P turn into a span over here. And then it's only going to touch the DOM to change that one thing. We're not going to change all of these elements. So if the state is similar enough, you can even simply transition the state with watchers. Here I've built from scratch a chart with Vue, and as the data changes, the watchers will update it and simply transition between them. SVG is also really great for this task because it's built with math. I didn't use D3 or Chartist or anything for this. I'm just using those Vue directives to spin up D3 and create this chart. So here we have a simple select, and we have that V model again. Now you're used to the V model. And we, in our actual Vue instance itself, we have that initial selected, and then we also have a bunch of options. So we have that first data set, second data set, third data set. So first we'll create our dummy object that will be updated by our animation library. Then we have an update function that's invoked on every tween step. We'll use this to push the data. Then we create an object to store the source data to be tweened and the function pointer for the update events. And in this for loop, we're going to turn the current index into a string, and then we can tween over our target dummy object, but we'll only do this for the specific key. I mentioned before that SVG is built with math. If you pair SVG with directives in Vue, you don't even need a charting library. So here I'm using V for loops and vbind to create a really flexible axis for our chart. The bars itself are even easier to update. They're simply rects. So no need for a giant charting library or anything. So probably a lot of you are familiar with the benefits of SVG, but just in case you aren't, here are some of the highlights. It's crisp on any display. You don't have to do any kind of image replacement or anything. It's less HTTP requests to handle. It can be no HTTP requests to handle because you can write it all inline just like HTML. It's easily scalable for responsive. It's in the name, scalable vector graphics, so it can expand or collapse. It's a really small file size if you design for performance. If you design for performance is a really important part of this, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. It's super easy to animate. It has a navigable DOM. All of the things that you normally do, like slap a class on something and then apply an animation to it, those are still accessible to you with SVG. So it's just like working with normal HTML. Because it has a navigable DOM, it's also really easy to make accessible, which is nice for screen readers and things. So SVG is incredibly flexible. I made this animation to celebrate the Yarn release. I can make it bounce and snap by playing with path values and template literals. I think loaders are a great case for SVG. SVG can be really small if you design for performance. I have this extension called Honey that looks for coupons across the web, and it takes about a minute to go through it. So it has this little SVG animation and also this loader and also a few other things going on that show me what codes they're testing. So I don't mind waiting for that full minute while these things are going. If it didn't give me this kind of loader experience, I probably would ditch out. So I made this animation for Smashing Magazine's checkout experience, and the big deal here isn't really the animation itself, but rather that despite this being a fairly complicated graphic, this whole SVG and animation and everything is just 6 kilobytes. This makes SVG particularly impressive in performant medium if you use it correctly. So we've heard a lot of people talk about performance. Someone had a quote on Twitter, and I can't remember what the attribution is right now, but it said, if you want to be a performance expert, you have to be an images expert. And I think that's really true, because the bulk of what we're delivering on the web that's really heavy tends to be images. So I'm going to make a super brief detour here to clarify what the scalable means when we refer to scalable vector graphics. You can see here when we place the graphic directly inline in the HTML, it has width and height attributes, which keep it to that size. Now, if I take these out, you can see the graphic take up the whole screen. And in CSS, I can make it constrained to the viewport width and height. I can also make it fill it up in the space of a CSS grid or flexbox or anything goes. The graphic and its innards stay totally consistent. So if you don't like positioning things in CSS, SVG is incredible because you can see how stable that graphic is no matter what I do with it. And even though there's multiple elements inside of it, you can now access all of them. And that goes for fonts and text as well. So with all of that in mind, that means we can do things like this that are fully responsive in every direction. And since our animation is working within the SVG coordinate system, I don't have to adjust any values or any media queries in responsive development. It's all perfectly stable no matter what we do. So if we keep like replaying this, we can make this any size, and the animation totally stays stable. So people tend to classify SVG as a very flat medium and think of it as inflexible, but the truth is we can mine what's available to us in the spec and mix creativity and programming. Here we're interpolating blur and contrast filters as well as morphing path values and randomizing opacity. The visual output can be as elemental as a candle flickering. This is part of the reason why I love JavaScript for animation so much. We're not bound by the spec. SVG filters aren't technically animatable properties, but with request animation frame and any library that uses it under the hood, we can alter any property that we want as long as they're numerical. So we can make smoke. So SVG animation in Vue.js are really, really good bedfellows. Let's talk about how some ways to animate SVGs with Vue. Since SVGs offer a navigable DOM, we can use Vue directives with them, as well as transition components, you name it. So Vue and SVG animation were kind of made for each other. So let's look at this little Wally I made from a dribble shot here. Wally has a looping animation for the, oh, I actually should turn the sound on, but maybe you can't hear it. He says, wow. Wally has a looping animation for the way that he, there he goes, looks around and blinks, and then as my mouse, or in this case his little cockroach friend, moves around, he follows his little buddy around. It's also worth mentioning that anytime you cause a user to feel something, it ties with their limbic system, and it allows them to remember a little bit better. So in the Vue template, we create a mouse move event in the HTML, and then in the methods in JavaScript, well, there's a bit of logic that I'm not going to go over here that can't fit on a slide, but basically we can plug into the event values and use Greensock Animation API's progress to plot along those values, keeping it paused as we do so. So basically, the way that I created this animation is I make an entire animation, including easing, of his arms going out and him reaching for that cockroach. Then I pause the animation, and I plot the progress of the animation along with the mouse move event and how it moves across ePageX. So SVG also supports this thing called ClipPath, which has the greatest support ever. It's like Chrome 1, Firefox 1.5, basically the first version of a lot of browsers. This allows us to show and hide information. Like his arm there, you can see, was coming in and out of view. I couldn't really tuck that under something because there's pieces of it that's showing and pieces of it that's not showing. So ClipPath allows us to reveal information like that. So SVG allows us to do that. And we don't even have to animate in order to interpolate states either. Vue offers class and style bindings. So you might have seen similar demos to this with CSS variables and JavaScript. But in this case, Vue allows us for much wider support to IE browsers as well. So in the Vue instance, I have the x and y values that start with 0, and I'm basically plotting them to eClient x and y. So then in the template itself, I can hook those up to perspective origin, and it changes the perspective of all of those SVG paths and makes this weird Tron-like experience. So all of these lovely Vue directives that we saw earlier help us work with form elements that can also help us manipulate and interact with SVG on the fly as well. So SVG has a navigable DOM. We can spin up pieces of it on the fly, change its output, and of course play and pause animation as we or the user kind of wishes here. So since SVG is flexible, we can also allow our user to download it, whatever they made on the fly too. And the graphic will even respect the exact position of the animation at that point in time too. Pretty cool. So if we download this, then we open it up, you can see that it's actually pausing in that exact point of view. So here inside the HTML template, we'll create some semantic form elements, and the button click will bind to a method that we define in the Vue instance. In the create big circles event, we get the reference of the SVG in the correct namespace and spin up some circles using helper functions for random sizes that I call things like totes rando because I'm a nerd. So to create the animation, we'll do something very similar. Here we have form elements with the buttons, and we can play and pause the animation. And then we can begin an animation timeline or pause it depending on the interaction. We can also take this a step further and use Vue to manipulate animation midstream. Here we have a ball bouncing, but we can use a little physics and request animation frame. So no animation libraries here. We're just creating a ball bounce using some physics equations. But we can also update the subsequent bounces as well, changing its gravity along with its radius. So all of those things are really, really flexible and easy to use. So there's more info that I'm not showing here. But basically, we have the initial total height and the total radius that we're storing in data. Then we have the methods that will be called to increase the height or radius as we click a button. And then we have the initialization of that animation, and it has some gravity to it. So we have things like gravity increases the vertical speed. I tried to comment this well for everybody. Horizontal speed increases the horizontal position, and if the ball hits the ground, we'll reverse the animation and reduce its speed. So we're also going to change that button based on whether or not the animation is running. You can see how legible that is. And then we can use request animation frame to use that bouncing ball method that we saw earlier. So far, all of our animations have been in lockstep with one other piece, or small piece of our application. But what if we have a giant application and we need to manage state all over the place? If you have things like shared needs, sometimes you want to use something like Vuex, which is similar to Redux, like a centralized store. Just to let you know, you can use Redux in a Vue application. I would say that if you're familiar with Redux, Vuex is not that hard to understand. It'll feel very comfortable to you. But it might make more sense to use Vuex because it's kind of framework specific. So how do we create something that feels like a seamless transition between states in our app? In figuring out how to do so, you can create small storyboards of your existing design and try to find similar elements so that you can transition them together instead of completely breaking their context. So once we've encapsulated what's changing, each component owns its own state. The entrance and exit will always be consistent, and we can reuse components, change their order, and manage their state in a really clean and simple manner. In this example, I'm not even passing the state around. I create a central store with Vuex, and in mutations, I can number the templates, toggle their visibility, and advance the template. So basically, what I'm saying here is once you get to the fourth one, go ahead and loop back around to that first one again. And then in the components themselves, I'm wrapping the whole thing in a transition element. And then I have this, like, if it's template 1, show this component. If it's template 2, show this component, and so on and so forth. So this is all inside of one SVG. We have different components based on the state of our store, each with their own entrance. And here we commit to the store whenever the toggle fires, and we have our animation logic. But since they all have different ways of entering, but similar ways of exiting, we use the transition component to kind of keep all of the transitions of the exit the same. But when we enter, we're actually plugging into a lifecycle method called mounted. So if we want to work with any of these lifecycle methods, you can see a whole bunch of them here. Before create, created, before mount, mounted. If you work with things like React, you're used to things like that with like component will mount, component did mount, things like that. So in Vue, these would be called before create, created, and things like that. So here we have before create and then the console log that's happening there. If you've never worked with a custom directive before, we're going to go over how to create them really quickly, and then we'll apply those to animation. So directives are tiny commands that you can attach to DOM elements. They're prefixed with V to let the library know that you're using a special bit of markup and to keep syntax consistent. And they're typically useful if you need low-level access to some bit of HTML for a bit of behavior. When we create a directive ourselves, we'll have access to precisely the moment when the element is inserted into the DOM, when it's updated, when the children are updated, or when it's removed. So it's similar to the lifecycle methods for a component. It's just a little bit different for things like directives. So if we have something like we're going to call our new custom directive tac, here's how we would create a custom directive. It's probably most common to hook into bind. And it's not actually that useful yet. All we're doing is passing in the element, and we're setting the style to position fixed. So, that's not that great. So let's do one better. We can pass a value into the directive, so we can make it a little bit more flexible, and we can tell the vtac directive to stick this element at the page at 70 pixels from the top. So that's a little bit better. We're scrolling down the page, 70 pixels from the top. Now we can pass in an argument. If we don't specify anything, it will be tacked to the top. But if we do, it'll be tacked to the left instead. So that's a little bit better. And now it'll be tacked to the left instead. So that's an argument. But we can do one better than that as well. So let's pass in more than one value. And now we can make this really flexible and tack the element anywhere. You can see I could keep going here and make right and bottom and things like that. So here we've got 40 pixels and then 100 pixels. So let's apply this to animation. In this example, we'll create a directive that attaches to a scroll event and allows you to hook into functionality and do an animation or something, and then removes the listener. So this is actually kind of normal, right? Like a lot of times you'll have an application that on scroll you want some sort of animation to occur. And a lot of times you have these big libraries to do so. And so in Vue, with only like 5 lines of code, I can eliminate an entire library like scroll magic or waypoints or something like that, and just hook into this Vue custom directive that I've created. So now we're cooking with gas. We can emit an entire library and orchestrate interactions on our pages really, really easily. So I'm in the process of making this demo, but here's a sneak peek. We can use these custom directives to hook into D3's functionality and do some scrolly telling and make all these crazy interactive graphics appear with NASA data and things. So here you see our custom directive in action. We can use these to update circles based on Fireball data and update all of the visualizations on this page. So I'm not going to go through all of this code, but basically I'm hooking into D3's functionality and changing it and updating it based on where we are on the page. The last thing we'll do today is take a look at Nuxt routing and page transitions. So this one's going to be really fun. Nuxt is a really great CLI tool for building Vue applications with little to no configuration. And you might have heard people talk about server-side rendering of late. One particularly compelling aspect is the performance benefit. So when we render our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the server, we have less JavaScript to parse both initially and on subsequent updates. This is one of my favorite quotes about server-side rendering by Carl Seguin. By rendering on the server, you can cache the final shape of your data. Instead of grabbing JSON or some other information from the server, parsing it, and then using different pieces of that layout for of that information, we're doing those calculations up front. So we're taking all of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we need. This can actually reap a lot of benefits, including caching and SEO, and speed up our apps and sites. There's also a lot of other nice features for Nuxt. We have things like automatic code splitting, powerful routing systems, great lighthouse scores out of the gate. Oh, I knocked it. Okay, back. Static file rendering, ES6 transpilation, hot reloading in development, preprocessors, the ability to just write Vue files for your pages and layouts so you don't have to learn a whole nother thing. You're just using the same thing that you've already learned with Vue applications. And my personal favorite, we're easily adding transitions to your pages. So you don't have, if you don't already have Vue CLI installed, here's that command. We only have to run that once. And then we will say something like Vue init, Nuxt starter, my project, or whatever your project's name is, cd into that, and yarn, or npm install, and npm run dev. You'll be given an index page in a pages directory, and if you dump that content and create a simple Vue file with a Nuxt link, create a duplicate of that page, and have links that point to each other, you get this. A fully routed single page application with server-side rendering without ever stepping outside of a Vue file. That's really, really cool. So Nuxt is amazing because it already provides us with a transition hook. So we don't have to wrap a transition hook in any of our pages or anything. It already gives us one, and the default name will be page. So we can hook into page enter active, page leave active, and apply all sorts of animations and transition to these pages. Ta-da, that's pretty cool. We don't just have to use transitions either. We can create animations too. Of course, my favorite thing are JavaScript hooks. So we have transition modes available to us, so we can have something happen in one page, wait for the other, that page to be done, and then the other page comes in, and we can use these hooks all to create animation logic. So here we have CSS false, that mode that you saw earlier, and then all of the normal animation logic. So we can create these really seamless and stylish transitions that change per page. You can see here that the way that the text, the mountains, and the letters all come in and leave are totally different per page. And since we're working with SVG, we can also make this really fully responsive really, really easily as well. And that took maybe 2 lines of media query. Here's the repo if you want to go explore the code as well as the demo site. Vue and Nuxt make it extraordinarily simple to create complex and beautiful interactions that feel seamless to our users. We can connect states and reduce cognitive load for things that are changing in our application with ease. And I'd like to say, finally, on a personal note, that sometimes building and maintaining large applications under corporate deadlines can kind of burn you out. This started to happen to me, and by working with animations, something that gives both you and your users a dopamine rush of excitement, I was able to stave off burnout and remember why I love working on the web so damn much. Thank you so much. And these slides are available at that URL as well.
Hello. Hey, hi, Sarah. Praveen here. Great talk, great demos there. So I have a question that oftentimes it's required that we animate stuff that's not natively animatable in CSS, right? For example, when you're fading in and fading out, instead of opacity, you would want to use display properties, or changing from width 0 to width auto value, which is not natively supported. So is there a way that we can do it in transition component of Vue.js?
So if I understand you correctly, if you have to do something like visibility hidden or something like that instead of
opacity? Yeah, but
hidden?
instead of visibility or opacity, we'll use display property that has to be transitioned.
Yeah, actually, that's a really great question. I tend to use libraries like GreenSock, which allow for things like AutoAlpha, which will give you both the ability to transition all the way to fading the opacity and create visibility hidden at the same time. But the thing that I think is really compelling about the transition component in Vue is that in-out mode. Because when you have things that are kind of mounting and mounting and unmounting from the DOM and disappearing or appearing in opacity, then it's really important to not have both things in the DOM at once. So if you have those transition modes, you can make sure that something's fully out before the other thing comes in. So yeah, Vue does offer things like that.
Just one small question. So do the JavaScript hooks also use request animation frame internally to get the transitions done?
No, they're simply hooks. So you can basically use whatever you want to create those animations. I used CSS animation. Sometimes I used request animation frame. Sometimes I used a library. All they do is offer you points in time that you can hook into some other functionality. So you write the animations yourself. Vue just gives you those like moments that you hook into.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Any more questions? Doesn't look like that. Cool. Cool. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was one of the bestest animations I have ever seen. And in few of the animation, I was really could not differentiate whether those are video recorded or animations. Great effort. Thank you so much. I hope that sometime down the line you will be creating animated movies via CSS and SVG. I hope so. It looks like that.